There are many people whom I met in my Hijikata archive. So now I start. Before beginning my plenary session, I like to say a few words of thanks. Firstly, I'm extremely grateful for the support we have received from a number of individuals and institutions, and in particular for the assistance of the Aomori Museum of Art as a member of the PSI TOHOKU organizing committee. I'd also like to offer my particular thanks to Mr. Stefan Baba for presenting with me at this plenary lecture, and to Caitlin Coker-san for assisting me as a translator. Caitlin-san, よろしくお願いします。Lastly, I'd like to thank you for all joining us today. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome participants from all over the world to this PSI TOHOKU conference in Aomori. I'd like to begin my lecture with a few words about the founder of Ankoku Butoh, Hijikata Tatsumi. Hijikata was born in Akita Prefecture, which is another area of the Tohoku region, in which Aomori is also included. I believe many of you joined us on the Osorezan tour yesterday, so I am sure you had the chance to experience an unusual atmosphere of Tohoku at that sacred site. The regional climate and culture of Tohoku was incredibly influential on Hijikata's philosophy and style of dance. I might be considered as the basis for his creative expression. But before going into detail about Hijikata's Tohoku, I'd like to speak about his time in Tokyo. Those of you with an interest in Butoh dance have probably come across the short performance Kinjiki, often translated as Forbidden Colors, which is often considered as the starting point of Butoh. Kinjiki had a dramatic effect on the Japanese dance scene. It proposed new conceptual publicities for physical expression, even before the movement known as Butoh had been formally named. Kinjiki was not a merely product of changes in the performance landscape of the time, but in fact infected those changes. Hijikata created his Kinjiki a new environment for performance in Tokyo. That is, he proposed a new concept of dance. This is, of course, gathered interest, and those who sympathized with Hijikata's new vision of Butoh began to gather around him. The result was a change in the dramatic dance audience, with people who would not have normally attended modern dance performances turning up the Butoh performances, and so we might consider Hijikata's work as the origin of a revolution in dance during the 1960s. Do you know these voices? Okay? You don't know. We should still ask, however, what made this revolution possible? What allowed for Hijikata to effect the change when he did? In order to answer these questions, we must first get a sense of some biographical details in the decade preceding the making of Kinjiki. Looking back 10 years, we found Hijikata having recently arrived in Tokyo, having run away from his hometown Akita. At that time, the air raids of World War II had resulted in food and housing shortages in the capital, leading to legislation that made it illegal for people to move from the countryside to Tokyo. For some living illegally like Hijikata, it was not possible to buy rice, kome, or eat out in resistance gohan. As you can all imagine, this was an extremely difficult period for Hijikata. And in postcards sent back to his friends in Akita, we find appeals for pity and requests for their help. Hijikata spent time wandering through the ruined streets of Tokyo. He would often change addresses and be forced to endure periods of poverty. Eventually, he settled down in a lodging for the poor near the Furukawa River, named the House of Rehabilitation. There were about 8 people living in this lodging, sharing a single dormitory full of 3-tiered bunk beds. ちょっと曽我さん高いね。曽我さんもうちょっと落としてもらえる。すいません。There was no living room and only a single toilet in the corner of the room. The area around the lodging was known as a place for the poor, where those at the bottom of Tokyo's social scale gathered. Hijikata managed to make a living for himself as a lay labor. As a combination of this week and speaking the Akita dialect led to deep-set feeling of inferiority. Hijikata was also addicted to the drug Hiropon at time, which gradually led to his mental decline and serious mental breakdown. It was dance that outstained Hijikata emotionally and restored him to his senses. He had learned German Neue Tanz as a modern dance in Akita, but after moving to Tokyo, he began to work as a jazz dance, frequently appearing on TV films and stage. There are very few records from the period of his work as a jazz dancer. One of the things we know was that a friend took him to the Mannencho area of Tokyo near Ueno Station, where he first came into contact with Tokyo's cross-dressing community. Hijikata was impressed to find that these cross-dressers were making a fair living. This encounter became an important influence on Hijikata's conception of dance. Another critical encounter for Hijikata was with the writing of French novelist Jean Genet. Genet's own story also had a profound effect on Hijikata, as he felt a kindred sense of misery and poverty. It is not clear precisely when Hijikata read Genet's novel, The Thief's Journal, but we know the book was translated into Japanese in 1953 during the period when Hijikata was living at the lodging house, while he himself liked to call the thief's house. Jean-Paul Sartre's theory of Genet became a resource for Hijikata's own theories of dance. Sartre recounts the absurdism of Genet, who had already decided to become a thief and pursued the idea of evil as a child. This encounter with Genet both comforted Hijikata with a feeling of sympathy for another artist's comparable hardship, but also became the creative starting point on new dance piece. What Hijikata took from Genet was an understanding of evil as a core of human experience and the skeptical attitude towards democratic ideology of post-war Japan. But this intellectualizing of Genet alone could not generate the physiological component of dance expression. For that, Hijikata needed to develop a new movement methodology. So we might next ask what Hijikata's technique looked like. Hijikata had mastered Neue Tanz, jazz dance, classical ballet, and dance for entertainment shows. But how did Hijikata move beyond these established techniques? An important stepping stone was Hijikata's meeting with Tetsuji Takeshi, a famous reformer of traditional kabuki and director of plays and film. Hi. 徐々に雑音じゃなくなるんです。はい。 はい、そうですね。はい、すみません。ケイトリンさんに説明してもらってください。Hijikata voice, more two voices, yes. Normal voice. OK。どこまで読んだか分からなくなっちゃいます。You could find the whose voices are gradually, okay? どこまで読んだか分かりません。Hijikata had mastered Noyetan jazz dance, classical ballet, and dance for entertainment shows. Okay? Takeshi, oh, I see. Thank you very much. But how did Hijikata move beyond these established techniques? An important stepping stone was Hijikata's meeting with Takeshi Tetsuji, a famous reformer of traditional kabuki and the director of plays and films. Takeshi was both knowledgeable about traditional performing arts and also up to date with new trends in theory and practice coming to Japan from overseas. For example, the new art and formal had been imported from France at that time and swept quickly through the world of contemporary Japanese art. Takeshi applied this theory to his direction of plays. Around this time, French music concrete also caused a stir in the Japanese avant-garde scene, and Takeshi employed this style in his production too. When Hijikata, a known dancer from Akita, appeared in Takeshi's dance work Dojoji, it gave him the opportunity to directly experience Takeshi's direction. Kinjiki can be considered to have synthesized these various influences: art and formal, music concrete, and Takeshi's directional method. To give a specific example of how these new French influences came into the piece, we can hear a voice in Kinjiki speaking words "Je t'aime." The recording was taken in a traditional Japanese style closet and oshiire in Kazuo Ono's house. In fact, Hijikata relied on the support of Kazuo Ono's great deal in the preparations for Kinjiki. The practical question of where he could rehearsal for the performance is important. We know, for example, that one of rehearsals was done at the studio of the famous dancer Takaya Eguchi, and other at the studio of Nobuto Shitsuda. Takaya Eguchi, in fact, originated from Aomori, and there are some materials recording his activities in this museum. Eguchi was a pioneer of modern dance in Japan who had traveled to Germany prior to the war with his wife Misako Miya in order to learn Noyetan's at the studio of Mary Bigman. Upon his return to Japan, Eguchi disseminated this new style of dance under the name Shinko Buyo. Many students gathered around Eguchi, who was incredibly active in the period after the war. One of these students was Kazuo Ono, and the other was Katsuko Masumura, who Hijikata then studied Noyetan's under. The second dancer whose studio Hijikata used for the rehearsals was Nobuto Shitsuda, who went over to Germany before the Second World War and learned expressionist dance at the studio of Max Stellpis in Berlin. after the war, Tsuda started his own modern dance troupe, which Hijikata likely started to visit around the beginning of 1959. It was at Tsuda's studio that Hijikata met the like-minded avant-garde dancer Miki Wakamatsu and also the dancer Akiko Motofuji, who would later become his wife. The latter was a meeting that would profoundly affect both Hijikata's personal life and the founding of Butoh. Tsuda's influence on Shinjiki was strong. Tsuda had a number of female pupils devoted to him, who appeared radical even to Hijikata. He also had a particular sensitivity to languages and deployed an unusual mix of sacred and sexual words or specific philosophical terms to that diction and syntax really read as nonsensical. This experience of Tsuda's method, as well as the influence of European artists, can be taken as a backdrop to the development of Hijikata's own method. His experience of living in a lodging for the poor was also critical in fueling the revolution in dance that marked the beginning of Butoh. The works Hijikata made in the years after Kinjiki were similarly remarkable. He produced these works under the heading of dance experience and devoted his practice to the exploration of avant-gardism and experimentation. The influence of modern dance remarked in his work at this time. During these years, Hijikata was fascinated with motifs of death and eroticism influenced by the writings of Georges Bataille and Jean Genet. He was also working to create a dance that could confront the values of productive society. This was in line with the activities of anti-art, which were becoming active in Tokyo in the early 1960s. Indeed, Hijikata often collaborated with other avant-garde artists to produce kind of anti-dance. He would perform improvisations, actions that were intentionally meaningless or purposefully make use of amateur dancers. The divisions between art and non-art, and art and everyday life were broken down, and Hijikata's dance was part of this revolution. But none of these answers the questions of whether we should call Hijikata's activities of this time Butoh or not. I think we can rediscover the significance of Hijikata's dance in the early 1960s if we don't place it within the history of Butoh. But then what should we call it? I would term it happening. Happening performances have been imported by Yoko Ono from New York, and Hijikata was one of the audience members at Ono's first happening. I should clarify, however, that Hijikata understood happenings as something quite specific. He argued that it was not real happening if it was product of the brain rather than the body. The happening had to be based on human physiology and sensitivity of the skin. Susan Sontag's writing on happenings provides a useful reference. In her essay, Happening, an art of radical juxtaposition, Sontag says that we have to consider the ideas behind surrealism in order to understand the happening. According to Sontag, this surrealist thinking can be discovered in the work of Antonin Artaud. In other words, putting Artaud's theory into action is a happening. when Sontag's theory meets with Hijikata's dance piece, Amma, it brings new meaning. Amma was a dance piece that intentionally opposed logical meaning. It was intended to create terror in the audience, with both audience and performer treated as objects. These performances can be seen to materialize the idea of terror that Antonin Artaud proposed, and so might be considered as happening according to Sontag's definition. Hijikata was the best happener, and so might be seen as originator of the Japanese happening. I'm afraid I have no time to speak to length on Hijikata's TOHOKU now, but Akita became increasingly important to him after this period of activity. In 1968, he claimed, "I am the origin of dance in Japanese." And from this point on, began to run back towards memories of his boyhood in Akita. In this way, Hijikata strove to become the origin of Japanese dance through his origins in TOHOKU. These boys are Hijikata and Antonin Artaud. Do you know? Okay. So I hope that we can all find some answers to his many questions being here together in TOHOKU. I thank you all again for coming, and I pass over to Stefan Barber for the discussion time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Morishita-san, for this wonderful lecture, and especially about this very formative, vital period of the end of the 50s, which I guess has, until Morishita-san's research into it and into its surviving traces, has been very obscure, but at the same time is really the crucial moment in the origination of Butoh dance. I'm very, very fascinated how the Hijikata archive will develop into the future, and I'd like to invite questions about, especially from those people who've engaged with the Hijikata archive, and would like to speak about Morishita-san's work there. So please come to the microphone if you have a question.
So thank you for brilliant introduction to the work and the context. And the archive was described as shrouded in mystery by Stephen, and I would like to ask you, please, which 3 items in the archive do you think are the most interesting, mysterious, yet to be come into being?
Can I just check that you asked for the 3 most mysterious items in the archive?
Yes, the most intriguing, most mysterious, yet to be fully discovered.
We have no mysterious object in archive. But your question is, Butoh が全面的に公開されてない。
All of the Butoh are not completely made public yet.
ブトーフのスクリプトシートがだいたい2000面あるって。はい、2000面。
There's about 2,000 pages.
いずれ公開すればミステリーがなくなると。
And it's a mystery as to when we can make it public.
あと2つ。
2 more.
まあ私がいることが不思議かもしれない。
And the fact that he's there is also mysterious.
ぜひアーカイブに来て確かめてくださ
So please come to the archive and check it out.
い。もう一つ。
One more.
慶応大学にアーカイブがあるということですね。
The fact that the archive is in Keio University.
なぜ慶応大学にあるのか、まあ私にもわからないんですけども、
Even I don't understand why it's in Keio University.
でもまあたくさんの人がアーカイブ見に来ていただいているので本当に嬉しく思います。ありがとうございます。
He's very happy that many people come to the archive. Thank you so much.
はい、どんどん歓迎いたしますので、ぜひますますアーカイブ訪れてください。
He welcomes you, so please come and visit.
Another question?
Morishita-san, thank you for your stimulating talk.
はい、Thank you very much.
Yeah, I have a question about surrealism, since you mentioned it in your talk. And I think once in his life, he said that, because many people said that the rebellion of the body, has the influence of surrealism. Of course, there are many other influences. And he said that my performances has nothing to do with surrealism, because nothing to do with happening, especially, and because happening lack the rigorous training and rigorousness that I have in my Butoh. And I want to ask you about his idea about happening, and also since you mentioned surrealism, and he incorporated quite a few surrealist paintings in Butoh, and so could you also elaborate on that? So my question has two parts. One is his response to happening, and also his use of surrealism. Thank you so much.
難しいたくさんだったね。
2問があって、1つはスリリズムが肉体の判断へ影響したっていうことで、先ほど土方はハプニングと関わっていたとおっしゃったんですけど、土方自身がパフォーマンスはハプニングと関係ないと言ったことがあるらしくて、それはハプニングはしんどいトレーニングをかけているから僕の動きと関係ないと土方がおっしゃったことがあるらしくて、じゃあ土方のハプニングのアイディアは何なのかと、あとシューレリズムどうやって武闘風の中に生かされているかと、その2つを聞いています。
シューレリズムが土方の武闘の中に生きている一番の例証はやはり土方が振り付けの動きに使っている絵画作品だと思います。
Well, of course, the use of surrealism in HIJIKATA'S work is the influence of those paintings on his choreography.
それともう一つやはり土方自身がもともとシュリアリスム的な考えを持っているということですね。決してシュリアリスムの影響を受けたこともありますけれども、本質的に土方がそういう考え方を持っているということ。
And another thing is that, of course, HIJIKATA was perhaps influenced by surrealism, but rather than that, his thinking essentially is very surrealistic.
でもう一つの質問、ハプニングについてですけれども、土方が否定したハプニングというのは、いわゆる日本で一般に言われているハプニングであって、スーザン・ソンタクが例唱したような本質的なハプニング理解とまた別だと。
The happening that HIJIKATA critiqued was the general happenings that happen in Japan, and it's different than the happenings that Susan Sontag is talking about.
日本では小野洋子さんが、ハプニングの最大の功労者といいますかね、ニューヨークから持ってきたということになっています。実際に土方自身こそハプナーといいます、ハプニストといいますか、非常に優れたハプニングの代表的な人であったというふうに私は考えています。
And of course, Ono Yoko was one of the greatest perpetuators of happenings. She came back from New York. But Morishita-san also thinks that Hijikata was an excellent, I guess, happeninger and a representative of that, of those happenings.
ぜひスー先生と一緒に土方のあんまを研究したいってリサーチしたいと思います。ぜひまた来てください。
So please come and we can research Hijikata's Amma together and think about it.
ちなみに、日本を代表する舞踏家であります笠井明さんも、あんまを大変非常に評価していまして、ご自身が自分もあんまをもう一度再発見というかもう一度踊ってみたいというふうにおっしゃっているということからしても、あんまっていうのは非常に重要な作品であると思います。
And it's a very important piece, and Kasai Akira himself also highly evaluates it, and he says that he wants to dance it one more time and rediscover it.
よろしいでしょうか。
Any other question? Oh, is that enough for your answer?
ぜひ今後とも一緒に研究させてください。
And please, let's research this together from now on as well.
Bruce, hello? Am I on? Bruce Baird from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Morishita-san, this was amazing. I want to thank you so much for this talk, which, I would like to spend like the next 4 hours discussing it with you. I want to stick with happenings for a second. What I didn't catch from the talk was how we know the precise connection between Sontag's understanding of happenings and Hijikata's understanding of happenings. This was unclear to me. Okay.
Sure.
土方はハプニングについて特に自分がどういう理解であるかっていうのはそれに語っていないわけですね。
Hijikata has not said expressly what his understanding of happenings is.
でスーザン・ソンタグのハプニングを土方が読んだかどうか、これ当然読んでると思いますけども、それはずっと後になってからのことで、1960年代の初めに土方が読んでるわけがないので、決してソンタグさんの批評に影響されているわけではなくて、アルトーと土方が同時に、アルトーが土方に影響を与えたわけではなくて、土方がアルトーにもちろん影響を与えているわけではなくて、同時に同じようなハプニングを行っていた。ここでいうハプニングは本質的な意味でのハプニングですけども、行っていたというふうに理解していいのではないでしょうか。
But of course, Hijikata did not read Susan Sontag's work in the early 1960s when he was performing happenings. If he had read it, it would have been later. But likewise, Arto and Hijikata did not directly influence each other. However, they were simultaneous. But like that relationship, Susan Sontag, Hijikata, they were not influencing each other, but simultaneously, essentially doing happenings. I'm sorry, Arto and Hijikata. That's what I meant.
ブルースさん、今の翻訳でいいですか？
And now a doubt of the translation.
But I heard you to say that Hijikata thought that happening had to be based on human physiology and sensitivity of the skin, that's what I was very curious about, is this precise configuration of happenings.
先ほど、土方さんのハプニングの理解は、そのヒューマンフィジオロジーとセンシティブなスキンに基づいているとおっしゃったんじゃないですか。
そうですね。それはその通りです。はい。ハプニング論ということではなくて、土方なりのその時代に、流行しているハプニングに対して批判的にした発言だと思います。
That's not Hijikata's theory of happening, but it's his critique of the happenings that were popular at the time.
だから土方はもうすでに秋田の子供時代に父親、母親と一緒にハプニングを行っていたというふうに言ってるわけですね。子供時代に家族の中でハプニング。
So even what was happening in Hijikata's own home in Akita with his mother and father, that in itself was also a happening.
バーバーさんも
Yes, I would like to ask a question as well. Really about your experience of being an archivist at the Hijikata archive over such a long period of time, with such extraordinary work, such original work that has required a great deal of commitment and concentration, and simply to evoke that experience of having been an archive of Hijikata's work for that lengthy period of time.
アーカイブのディレクターの経験についてですけど、すごい優れた作品にいつも携わっているから、何か感想ありますか？
私の土方についての理解はもちろん十分ではないと思うんですね。で、土方の資料を徹底的に調査はまだできていません。これはぜひ今後私だけではなくて、皆さんと一緒に、少しずつでも研究を進めることができればと考えています。
We haven't completely gone through all of the items in the archive, so instead of just Morishita-san himself, he would like to invite everyone to come and to look at these items together.
資料はすべて公開する方向で進んでいます。ただし、土方についての研究について我々がどこまで理解しているかというのはちょっとまだ、十分ではないので、今後我々も意識して皆さんの研究を業績を収集して皆さんと一緒に調査を進めたいと思います。
So we're progressing in a direction to hopefully make all of the materials public, but we really can't say exactly how much do we understand at this point. So because of that, we'd like to research with everyone and gather everyone's research accomplishments and continue on looking at everything.
これだけ舞踏が世界に広まっていくというのは我々はもちろん想像してなかったことなので、逆に海外からの人の舞踏研究、土方研究、大いに私ども期待していますし、私どもに刺激を与えてくれているわけですから、繰り返しますけども、ぜひ一緒にコラボレーションして、土方研究あるいは舞踏研究を進めることができれば大変嬉しいと思います。
And so the archive couldn't imagine that Butoh would have spread this much worldwide. And so there's great expectations in the research happening internationally, and it's a great stimulus, it's a great stimulant both for everyone at the archive, and to repeat himself, he'd love to collaborate with everyone.
One more question, Dominique?
Thank you very much for this very informative talk. And also thank you very much for all the help you've given me over the last 3 years that I've been here. And I've seen the progression of the notational Butoh over the last 3 years. And my question was really also referring a little bit to what we just touched on, that Butoh is going worldwide and it's really spread out. But what I feel is that the understanding of what Butoh might be is very disparate and changes from one place to the next. So my question is, who is the notational Butoh aimed at? Is it aimed at dancers who would like to understand more of maybe some gestures within Butoh? Is it intended to give more clarity to what Butoh is, so to make the term Butoh more clear? So just a little bit more about this wonderful book that you've given each of us. What's the intention? Thank you.
質問は
先の本、出版した本の意図は何ですか？その舞踏風は誰向けなのか、ダンサーなのか、そして舞踏風その用語をはっきりするためなのか、舞踏の理解はすごいバラバラで、場所、地域によって全然違いますし、広がってるから。
こういう形で、舞踏風の生の資料を含めて、出していただくのは、なくはないんですけども、それに私なりの意見を加えて、一冊にまとめてあります。でこれはダンサーに対してもそうです。それから研究者に対してもそれを共有したいという思いで、一応著者は私の名前になってますけども、これは誰が書いた本でもいいかと思いますので、これをベースにして、舞踏風研究をさらに展開できることを私も期待しているわけです。
Well, this Butoh, it's very raw. It's like it's listed in there just as it is. And then Morishita-san added his opinion to it. But however, he hopes to make it a base for dancers and for researchers in order to develop research even further.
いいですか？いいですか？はい。いいですか？ OK?
Is that all right? Any,
Next
did we answer all of your questions?
はい。
So thank you so much for this valuable, insightful lecture, Morishita-san. Thank you. And even though it was perhaps full of the ghost of Hijikata and Butoh, or perhaps the voices of the ghost of Osorezan, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. ありがとうございました。またぜひお会いしたいと思います。どうぞアーカイブに来てください。よろしくお願いします。